Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're stepping into what really feels like an advanced masterclass on one of the most famous passages in the entire New Testament. Most people open up John chapter 2 and their eyes go directly to the miracle of water turning to wine. But here's the thing. If you skip straight to the supernatural elements, you completely miss the precise stage the author spent so much effort building. In this explainer, we're going to establish the rigorous historical and literary controls required to uncover the true authorial intent of the wedding at Cana. We're going to treat this text not as some accidental collection of traditions, but as a carefully engineered literary environment. Today's architectural tour is going to guide us through a very specific blueprint. We'll lay down the exegetical foundation, draw our narrative boundaries, explore what's known as the Cana to Cana loop, define the crucial difference between a sign and a miracle, step into the cultural pressure cooker of the first century, and finally, secure the structure of the text itself. So, let's dive right into our first point, the exegetical foundation, and the real danger of skipping the setup. Before we can even think about performing any microlinguistic or discourse analysis without bias, foundational priority demands that we establish objective boundaries and historical parameters. If you skip this step, you're treating the text carelessly. You end up importing your own modern assumptions, rather than letting the author's meticulously engineered literary environment speak for itself. We absolutely have to secure the foundation first. That brings us to our second step, which is drawing the boundaries and isolating the pericope. To do this, we have to look at the Greek. Our incipient boundary in verse 1 reads, kai te hemera te trite, which translates to, and on the third day. This phrase initiates a hard temporal reset. It completely interrupts the rapid day-by-day calling sequences from chapter 1 and completes this really fascinating underlying creation week motif. Then, when we jump down to verse 12, the scene is securely sealed with our terminus boundary. Katebe es Capernaum, meaning, he went down to Capernaum. Now, that terminus boundary in verse 12 isn't just a random geographical detail. It actually uses a dense concentration of narrative shifts to lock the scene in place. First, we have a clear geographic shift away from Cana. Second, we have a participant shift as Jesus, his mother, his brothers, and his disciples transition from a localized domestic celebration to a mobile group. And third, we have a temporal transition zone, noting that they stayed there a few days. These explicit markers lock the pericope into a highly stable, self-contained unit. And what's truly amazing is that a critical audit of the textual apparatus reveals zero manuscript variants threatening these borders. The text is entirely secure. Zooming out a bit, let's look at our third point, the macro architecture of the Cana to Cana loop. This localized story actually functions as a massive structural framing mechanism called the Cana to Cana inclusio, and it formally opens the Book of Signs. Think of it in 3 phases. In phase 1, over in chapter 1, Jesus makes a theological promise to Nathanael that they're going to see greater things. Phase 2 happens right here in our text, the first sign at Cana, which serves as the immediate historical fulfillment of that promise. Then, the narrative sweeps all the way to phase 3 in chapter 4, where the second sign at Cana explicitly loops back to this exact geographical setting to close the frame. So why does this matter? The crucial takeaway is that this architectural law governs the entire opening of the Book of Signs. This macrostructural frame is alerting us, as readers, that all the intervening narratives, like Jesus cleansing the temple, his late-night conversation with Nicodemus, and his meeting with the Samaritan woman, must be interpreted through the lens of the theological realities unveiled right here at Cana. Now that we have our frame, let's move to section 4 and define our lens. Sign versus miracle. Genre classification completely governs your expectations as a reader. While synoptic parallels in other ancient texts might categorize raw displays of power simply as miracles meant to demand awe or relieve human suffering, John is doing something vastly different. He explicitly defines this event in verse 11 as a semeion, a sign. A Johannine sign is a highly intentional literary and historical pointer. It directs your eyes past the physical mechanics of the event, past the water, past the wine, past the jars, straight toward a deeper Christological reality. And what exactly is that deeper reality? It's doxa, his glory. The sign demands our examination, not to satisfy our modern curiosity about the mechanics of how water actually became wine, but to expose this exact concept, the inner reality of Jesus' divine identity.
Every single detail in this narrative was selected by the author for that singular purpose.
To truly insulate our interpretation from modern speculation, we step into Section 5, the cultural pressure cooker. We have to ground the narrative crisis in verifiable first-century cultural metrics. The setting is Cana. Unlike the grand religious center of Jerusalem or the bustling hub of Capernaum, Cana was an obscure, low-status agricultural village in the Galilean hills. This creates a brilliant, sharp rhetorical contrast. Think about it. The inaugural manifestation of the cosmic, pre-existent word's divine glory occurs in a small, ordinary domestic space rather than a center of political power. But we also need to understand the social capital at stake here. In this first-century culture, a wedding wasn't just a brief afternoon ceremony. It was a multi-day community celebration that could last up to a week. The hosting family had an absolute legal and social obligation to provide continuous hospitality. So the depletion of wine mentioned in verse 3, that wasn't a minor catering inconvenience. It was a devastating social catastrophe. It would result in immediate, lifelong public shame for the couple, signal financial insolvency, and could literally expose the family to lawsuits from disgruntled relatives. The entire narrative tension is fueled by this crushing legal and social pressure. Right into the middle of this exact, terrifying social crisis stand 6 massive vessels. But it's not just the number that matters. Their material composition is the absolute key to unlocking this scene. You have common clay pottery on one side and Levitical stone jars on the other. Unlike common clay, which easily contracted ritual impurity and had to be violently smashed under Levitical law, first-century rabbinic consensus classified stone as entirely immune to ritual defilement. The presence of these massive stone jars demonstrates that this specific household was strictly compliant with the rigid purity boundaries of Old Covenant Judaism. They represent the absolute apex of the Old Covenant system. John confirms this with a very specific Greek phrase, kataton katharismon ton judaion, which means for the purification rites of the Jews. This phrasing is huge. It grounds our text in non-speculative, verifiable, historical, and archaeological data. It proves beyond a shadow of a doubt that these vessels were permanently set apart to maintain cleansing and avoid contamination. They were the very vessels of the Old Covenant's purity system. All of this brings us to our final step, securing the structure. Let's quickly recap how we built this blueprint today. First, we isolated our incipient and terminus borders so the text stands completely on its own. Second, we tracked the micro and macro connections, revealing that massive Cana inclusio. Third, we properly identified the genre, not as a mere miracle, but as a Christological pointer, a sign. And finally, we grounded the terrifying social crisis in verifiable first-century metrics. Executing these 4 preliminary steps provides the absolute empirical baseline needed for all the subsequent discourse and linguistic analyses you'll do in your study. I want to leave you with a provocative thought to ponder. If this text is a rigorously engineered semeion, a carefully designed sign meant to show Jesus stepping into and completely replacing the very apex of Old Covenant purity, how does that radically transform our interpretation of the new wine itself? Now that you've got the proper exegetical lens, what deeper reality are we about to witness overflowing from those stone jars? Think about that as you dig into the text yourself. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and I'll see you next time as we continue to uncover the brilliant architecture of the text.